One place that's been in the news recently is Nigeria. So, Trump called Nigeria a disgraced country and said the government there needs to act quickly. He warned that if the U.S. attacks, it would be fast, vicious, and, almost sweet, in the way terrorist groups target Christians. That's how it was phrased. Abuja didn't respond immediately. The White House also didn't comment on when any military action might happen. The Department of Defense referred questions to the White House, but Secretary Pete Hegseth put out his own statement. He said the Department of War is preparing for action. His message was clear: either Nigeria protects Christians, or the U.S. will take action against Islamic extremists committing terrible atrocities. This all came just a day after Nigeria was added back to the U.S. list of countries of particular concern for violating religious freedom. That list also includes China, Myanmar, North Korea, Russia, and Pakistan. Before Trump posted his warning, Nigerian President Bola Ahmed Tinubu pushed back against claims of religious intolerance. He defended his country's efforts to protect religious freedom. He said calling Nigeria intolerant doesn't reflect reality and ignores consistent government work to safeguard freedom of religion for everyone, citing constitutional guarantees. Nigeria's foreign ministry also released a statement saying they will continue fighting violent extremism and hope Washington remains a close ally. They emphasized defending all citizens regardless of race, creed, or religion. Like America, they said Nigeria has no choice but to celebrate diversity. It's their greatest strength. Now the U.S. military presence in West Africa has been reduced, about 1,000 troops, and is used for regional operations. On Friday, Trump said thousands of Christians are being killed in Nigeria by radical Islamists, though no specifics were provided. Nigeria is complicated. 200 ethnic groups practice Christianity, Islam, and traditional religions. There's a long history of peaceful coexistence, but also flare-ups of violence, often due to ethnic divisions or conflicts over scarce resources. Boko Haram, the extremist Islamist group, has terrorized northeast Nigeria for years, killing tens of thousands over the last 15 years. Human rights experts say most victims are Muslims. Some U.S. lawmakers, like Representative Tom Cole, chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, supported Trump's move. They cited what they called the ongoing persecution of Christians. The fiscal 2026 National Security Appropriations Bill included increased funding for international religious freedom programs and support for Nigerian communities affected by extremist violence. Trump's redesignation of Nigeria as a country of concern opens the door to a variety of policy responses, including sanctions, though these are not automatic. Some religious groups had pressed for this designation in a letter last month. Trump said Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria, with thousands being killed by radical Islamists, and he urged the House Appropriations Committee to investigate. When you think about all of this, it's really a reminder of how complex geopolitics is, and how decisions ripple across societies in ways most people don't notice. It's not just numbers, it's people, it's communities, it's history, and that's what makes this situation in Nigeria so important to understand. Now, if we zoom out a bit, the context in Nigeria is, really layered. You've got, 200 ethnic groups, right, practicing Christianity, Islam, and traditional religions. Historically, there's been coexistence, but that coexistence is fragile. When resources are scarce or tensions rise, things flare up fast. Boko Haram has been operating in northeast Nigeria for years. They've killed tens of thousands, and it's mostly Muslims who are the victims. That's important because it challenges the simplified narrative we often hear. Extremism doesn't target just one group. It tears through communities indiscriminately, and yet, in the discourse we see, the focus tends to be narrow. So lawmakers like Representative Tom Cole have reacted strongly. He chairs the House Appropriations Committee. He's supporting the redesignation of Nigeria as a country of concern. The idea is to increase funding for programs that support international religious freedom and help communities in Nigeria affected by extremist violence. That's the fiscal 2026 National Security Appropriations Bill. The redesignation isn't just symbolic, it opens doors to policy responses like sanctions or waivers. They're not automatic, but the designation signals that the U.S. is watching and prepared to act. Religious groups pushed for this in a letter last month, pointing out that Christianity in Nigeria is facing an existential threat. Thousands are being killed, and radical Islamists are responsible for these attacks. Trump also called for investigations by the House Appropriations Committee. It's striking when you look at the scale of this. It's easy to reduce it to numbers, but every statistic represents people, communities, families, and that's why these decisions matter. They aren't abstract, they have real-world consequences. Nigeria's own response has been consistent. President Tinubu pushed back against claims of religious intolerance. He emphasized constitutional protections for all citizens, regardless of faith. The foreign ministry echoed this, saying they will continue combating violent extremism. They highlighted that Nigeria's diversity is its strength, similar to America in many ways. That's a perspective that's easy to overlook when headlines focus on violence alone. And then you layer in the U.S. military context. Troop levels in West Africa have decreased significantly over the last year. Around 1,000 troops withdrew from Niger, and there are only small groups left for drills. The largest base is in Djibouti, East Africa, hosting over 5,000 troops. It's a hub for regional operations. So when you connect the dots, Nigeria's internal challenges, the threat of Boko Haram, U.S. foreign policy, and congressional actions, you realize it's an incredibly complex situation. And complexity like this doesn't lend itself to simple solutions. You can't just, snap your fingers. Every decision has consequences that ripple across communities, countries, and even global geopolitics. It's also a reminder of the limits of power. The U.S. can influence, can signal, can provide support, but local governance, historical context, and social cohesion play an enormous role. You can't impose solutions from the outside and expect them to stick. That's why conversations about religious freedom, security, and policy responses are so intertwined. And honestly, when you think about it, this is why leadership matters. Not just in politics, but globally. The decisions you make, the way you prioritize, the way you communicate, they shape outcomes in ways that aren't obvious at first glance. That's true whether we're talking about technology, energy, space, or complex geopolitical issues like Nigeria. So this is not just a news story. It's a case study in the interconnectedness of politics, religion, security, and human behavior. It's also a reminder that even when situations seem intractable, clarity of purpose and commitment to principles, like freedom, human rights, and diversity, can guide actions in meaningful ways. Now, thinking about the scale of violence in Nigeria, it's staggering. Boko Haram has been around for over 15 years, and tens of thousands of lives have been lost. Most victims are Muslims, which is often overlooked in mainstream narratives. And yet the perception is sometimes simplified. Christian communities are under attack. Radical Islamists are the enemy. It's true, but it's not the whole picture. When you break it down, the violence isn't just about religion, it's also about economics, resource scarcity, and ethnic tension. Communities clash over land, water, jobs, and opportunity. Extremist groups exploit these divisions, and then the cycle of violence feeds itself. That's something to really understand if you're thinking about policy or humanitarian interventions. Lawmakers in the U.S. are trying to respond. Representative Tom Cole, for example, is pushing for increased funding for programs supporting international religious freedom. The idea is to help communities in Nigeria affected by extremist violence. It's not just money, it's targeted programs, aid and oversight, designed to create sustainable support, and to signal that the U.S. is taking the situation seriously. Trump's redesignation of Nigeria as a country of concern isn't symbolic. It's an open door for policy responses, like sanctions or waivers, which may or may not be implemented. But the message is clear: this is being watched, and there's accountability. Religious groups have been pressing for this, highlighting the existential threat to Christianity in Nigeria. Thousands are reportedly being killed by radical Islamists, and there's a call for Congress to investigate further. What's striking here is how perception and reality interact. Nigeria's leadership pushes back on claims of intolerance, emphasizing constitutional protections for all citizens, and the government's ongoing efforts to safeguard freedom of religion. The foreign ministry reinforces this, stating that diversity is a strength, and that violent extremism will continue to be opposed. That perspective is critical because it frames the situation beyond just the headlines and statistics. Military involvement is another layer. U.S. troop levels in West Africa are significantly reduced. Around 1,000 troops left Niger last year, and only small groups remain for drills. The largest base on the continent is in Djibouti, hosting over 5,000 troops and serving as a regional operations hub. Military presence matters, but it's only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. What's interesting, and sometimes overlooked, is the human element. Every statistic, every 1,000 Christians killed, represents families, communities, and lives disrupted. It's easy to get lost in numbers, but that human dimension is critical. Decisions made by governments, whether in Nigeria or the US, have consequences that ripple far beyond borders. When you think about leadership in this context, it's complex. Effective leadership requires understanding local dynamics, global politics, and the long-term consequences of actions. You can't just impose solutions. You need strategy, empathy, and foresight. That's why discussions about religious freedom, security, and policy are interconnected. They can't be treated in isolation. This situation also illustrates the importance of narrative. How events are framed can influence public perception, policy decisions, and international cooperation. Oversimplifying the story of Nigeria risks missing key factors: internal governance, ethnic dynamics, historical context, and the socio-economic drivers of violence. All of these matter if you want a solution that's effective and sustainable. At the end of the day, situations like this show why it's essential to think systemically. You can't just react. You need to understand the interdependencies between society, government, extremists, and international actors. And yes, there's urgency, but there's also a need for precision. Strategic interventions are far more effective than reactive measures. So this is why Nigeria isn't just another news story. It's a lens into the complexities of human society, governance, and the global order. And for anyone watching or involved, it's a reminder that decisions matter. They're not just policies, they shape lives, futures, and the structure of entire regions. Now, when we look at the bigger picture, it becomes clear that Nigeria is at a crossroads. You've got internal challenges, extremist threats, and a need for strong governance. At the same time, international actors, like the US, are signaling their concerns and readiness to act. That combination of internal and external pressures creates both risk and opportunity. Trump's warnings, the redesignation as a country of concern, and congressional attention all signal that this is serious. But what's often overlooked is the nuance. Leadership in Nigeria has been working to protect religious freedom and maintain stability. President Tinubu and the Foreign Ministry have both emphasized constitutional protections and the value of diversity. That's critical to remember, because solutions that ignore local realities rarely succeed. Military presence is a tool, but it's not the solution on its own. The largest U.S. base in Djibouti, regional drills, and troop deployments provide strategic leverage, but sustainable peace comes from within Nigeria, through governance, social cohesion, and addressing the root causes of extremism. That's a lesson that applies everywhere, really. You also have to consider the human dimension. Tens of thousands of lives have been affected by Boko Haram, and many are still living under threat. Every number in these reports represents a story, a family disrupted, a community in fear. That human perspective is easy to lose if you focus only on statistics, but it's essential for meaningful action. At the same time, it's important to understand how perception shapes policy. If the narrative is simplified, if only certain voices are amplified, then decision-makers may miss critical information. That's why comprehensive, nuanced analysis is essential. Understanding Nigeria requires looking at ethnic diversity, religious coexistence, resource distribution, and historical context all at once. Congressional initiatives, funding for religious freedom programs, and oversight efforts are all part of the U.S. response. They're designed not just to react, but to create a framework for ongoing support. That's a smart approach. Quick fixes don't work for problems that are deeply rooted. Looking at the global perspective, it's also a reminder that interconnectedness is real. What happens in Nigeria doesn't stay in Nigeria. Extremist groups, migration, and regional stability affect neighboring countries, international relations, and global security. That's why these discussions matter on a global stage. In the end, this is about responsibility. Governments, leaders, and even individuals all have a role in shaping outcomes. It's about foresight, strategy, and understanding the systems at play. You can't just react, you need to anticipate, evaluate, and act in ways that create real sustainable change. So, to wrap up, the story of Nigeria, the redesignation, the congressional responses, and the ongoing efforts to protect citizens of all faiths. These aren't just headlines. They're lessons in governance, human behavior, and the complexity of the modern world. And if there's one thing this teaches us, it's that thoughtful action, grounded in reality, and guided by principles, is the only way to make a meaningful difference.